In the early 1900s, a serial killer named Albert Fish plagued the northeast United States, having 3 confirmed victims with 5 additional suspected. Because of this number, he is classified as a serial killer, as serial killers have at least 3 victims over the course of more than a month. The nature versus nurture debate, that morality is either defined by one's nature from birth or the situations one finds himself in, is prevalent in this case. My initial hypothesis is that the reasoning behind his actions was mainly due to the mistreatment from his youth, which would suggest nurture over nature in this case. Albert Fish had a variety of mental disorders passed down from his family. His brother was forcibly instated into an asylum for an unknown illness, and his sister and 3 unknown relatives had other undiagnosed mental illnesses. However, his sister was not hospitalized. His uncle had been diagnosed with mania, and his mother had schizophrenia, which was mainly shown through visual hallucinations. Mainly due to this, in 1885 he was given to St. John's Orphanage by his mother following his father's death due to a heart attack, as she likely felt unable to take care of him. This orphanage had a history of abusing its children, leaving them without much education. Eventually, Fish had begun to enjoy the pain the beatings brought. He had stated in an interview when he was older, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong." In 1880, his mother had gotten a government job, being able to remove him from the orphanage. And 2 years later, in 1882, he had begun a relationship with the telegraph boy, who had introduced him to the concept of drinking urine and eating feces, which had led him to a twisted cycle that he had carried on for the rest of his life. In 1890, while he was 20 years old, he began his job as a prostitute, which he used as a front in order to rape children. This continued for 9 years, Fish growing an interest for sexual mutilation in the meantime, until his mother had orchestrated a marriage in 1898, where he was married to Anna Marie Hoffman when she was 20 and he was 29. Together they had 6 children. After their marriage, he had begun to work as a house painter while still using his profession as a front to rape children. This marriage lasted until 1917, when she had left him for John Schraub, a handyman for the family. He was left to raise the children by himself as he was given custody. Around this time, he had begun to experience schizophrenic hallucinations similar to his mother, believing that he was following the orders of God for what he was doing. He had also begun to self-harm, where he had begun to beat himself with nails in the name of God and self-mutilation itself. After his marriage, he was arrested for grand larceny in 1903 and sentenced to Sing Sing, a maximum security prison, and he was able to leave in 1910. As he does talk to people and seems outgoing enough to be trusted, he would likely be considered a psychopath, not a sociopath. While psychopaths have the ability to blend in further with society, those with sociopathy, also called antisocial personality disorder, act without regard as to how their actions will be perceived. However, both have at least a partial lack of empathy. Due to the nature of his crimes, it is evident that he lacks empathy, and this, combined with his ability to thrive in social situations, shows that he would fit the mold for a psychopath over a sociopath. After leaving Sing Sing in the same year, 1910, he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden while in Wilmington, Delaware. Kedden was mentally disabled, having an unknown mental illness, and had accepted Fish's request to start a relationship. After 10 days of their relationship, he was taken to a farmhouse where he was tortured for 2 weeks, finishing with Fish cutting off half of his penis. While he had wanted to cut off his body and take it home, he didn't want attention to be drawn to him, so he wrapped what was left of him in a handkerchief and left him. When asked, he said that he never heard what become of him or never tried to find out. While Fish had never abused his 6 children who had been left in his custody, he had on multiple occasions told them and their friends to beat him with nails and harm him in other ways. Soon he had begun to develop a fixation towards cannibalism and had often eaten meals of only raw meat and had occasionally fed these meals to his children. On July 14, 1924, a 9-year-old boy named Francis McDonald was reported missing by his family. He was found hung on a tree near his home that day, molested and strangled with his own suspenders, and gashes were found around the lower half of his body. Almost all flesh was removed from him. On the topic of the perpetrator, his mother had told police that he came shuffling down the street mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray. This had sparked his first nickname, the Gray Man. This was Fish's first victim, though it wasn't the last. Billy Gaffney was his next victim, first going missing on February 11, 1927, when playing with his friends Billy Beaton and his brother. When Gaffney hadn't returned for the night, his parents went searching for him, finding Beaton on the roof of the apartment building where they lived. When he was questioned about Gaffney, he responded, "The boogeyman took him." This led Fish to be called the Boogeyman, the second of his nicknames. There was a search, but he was never found. Later, Fish wrote a letter to the attorneys about what he did to the boy, a section of which goes as follows. "I stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Next day, about 2 p.m., whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. Then I cut him up. I cut him up through the middle of his body, just below his belly button, then through his legs about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and legs below the knee. Then I threw him into the pool of slimy water. He sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face, and belly." In early 1928, he had attempted the murder of a boy named Cyril Quinn. He had planned to use a meat cleaver, butcher's knife, and hacksaw, which he called his implements of hell. He had invited the boy and a friend over to his house, and once there, while they were on Fish's bed and he was downstairs, they had accidentally dislodged the mattress, revealing the implements of hell he was planning to use. They were presumably the first to escape the house alive. On May 25, 1928, Fish was looking through the newspaper, a method he'd often used in order to get new victims, when he saw a man named Edward Budd looking for a job. When he had arrived at the house intending to murder Edward, he had met Grace Budd. He convinced her parents to let her go to a party with him that night, and left with Grace. As Budd was killed in Wisteria Cottage, he had gained his new nickname, the Werewolf of Wisteria. As with Gaffney, a letter was sent to the parents of Grace Budd. We had lunch. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. I took her to an empty house in Westchester. I ran upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How did she kick? I choked her to death and then cut her into small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. She died a virgin. When it was finally realized that Fish had killed Grace, he was confronted by William F. King, the investigator. He went to the police station willingly, but had attempted to stab King with the razor blade he had in his pocket when they had arrived. Once disarmed and questioned, he confessed. His trial began on March 11, 1935, and it ended on the 21st. He had attempted to plead insanity, mentioning his delusions of God telling him to kill the children. However, the jury wanted him to be put to death, so they claimed he was perfectly sane. He had arrived to Sing Sing for the second time that same month, and was finally executed via electric chair on January 16, 1936. He was buried in the prison cemetery, where his grave is still able to be visited today. Allegedly, his last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here," while he helped the guards to adjust his electrodes. His known victims are Francis McDonald, Billy Gaffney, and Grace Budd. However, he is also suspected of the murders of Emma Richardson, Yetta Abramowitz, Robin Jane Liu, Mary Ellen O'Connor, and Benjamin Collings. My original hypothesis that Fish's actions were mainly caused by his mistreatment in the orphanage were mostly proven false, though not entirely. Though the majority of his actions may not have happened if he was not exposed to the mistreatment of the orphanage, the reason that he was brought there in the first place was his family's schizophrenia and history of mental disorders, which also allowed him to rationalize his actions and believe that they were of God's will. If his mental health was properly analyzed and treated, it is likely that he would not have gone down the path that he did. However, we cannot be sure of this. My original hypothesis would have counted as behaviorist thinking, as I believe that the external factors were the root cause of Fish's tendencies. However, there are alternate explanations. My latter hypothesis counts as biological psychology, as it focuses on the nervous system and physical aspect of the brain, and that Fish's schizophrenia was the root cause of his problems. Finally, some may believe in a functionalist perspective that Fish was adapting to the orphanage's lifestyle and allowing that method of thinking to continue into adulthood.